Mia sat at the dining table, absent-mindedly pushing around the remnants of her food, the fork scraping faintly against the porcelain plate. The room had an eerily quiet tension hanging in the air, as Grace, her stepmother, wiped the dishes at the sink with exaggerated care. It was always like this, silent, yet Grace moved with a deliberate grace, pretending she hadn't just made another jab at Mia's outfit, calling it inappropriate for a professional woman in her mid-20s. The words had stung more than usual today, and Mia knew it wasn't random. It never— "You're lucky your father isn't home right now," Grace muttered, finally breaking the silence, though her back was still turned. "You really ought to be careful with your choices, Mia. You don't want people to start thinking you don't know how to dress properly." Mia tightened her grip on the fork, the metal biting slightly into her palm. She glanced up at Grace's reflection in the window above the sink. Perfect posture, controlled movements, but beneath that facade there was something cold, something sharp. Mia fought to keep her voice steady. "I'm fine, Grace. It's just my work outfit. Nothing." Grace scoffed softly, placing a glass into the drying rack. "Work outfit, please. That's something anyone could wear to a casual lunch, not something someone should be wearing to a meeting with potential clients." Her tone was laced with condescension, always dissecting Mia's choices, like she had some responsibility to fix them. Mia sighed, pushing back from the table and standing up slowly, trying to keep her temper in check. "I don't care what people think about me, Grace. It's none of your business anyway." Grace whipped around suddenly, her eyes narrowing. "None of my business?" Her voice grew sharper. "I've raised you under this roof, and now I have to put up with your ridiculous attitude? I think it is my business to care about how you present yourself, at least enough to keep you from embarrassing the family." Mia clenched her fists. Every time Grace spoke like that, it felt like a tiny, invisible hand was tightening around her chest. It was always subtle. No shouting, just a constant undercurrent of disapproval. It made her feel small, like she could never measure up to whatever standards Grace thought were the correct ones. Her father, David, had been her protector for as long as she could remember, shielding her from Grace's sharp words and constant critiques. But he was away on a business trip again, just another one of those long stretches where he seemed to care more about work than the family. "You don't have to worry about me, Grace," Mia finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "I can take care of myself." Grace's lips curled into a thin smile. "Oh, I'm sure you can," she said, though there was no warmth behind her words. "But taking care of yourself and making sure you don't drag the rest of us down are two very different things. You know, your father has enough on his plate without having to clean up after your poor life choices." That was the final blow. Mia's heart sank, but she swallowed the lump in her throat, turning to leave the room. Every conversation like this left her feeling smaller, like she was stuck in some invisible cycle she couldn't break free from. And it wasn't just the insults. There were other things. The way Grace never let her forget her place in the family, always reminding her that she wasn't really a part of it. As she walked out of the kitchen and headed upstairs, she felt the familiar sting of tears beginning to prick at the corner of her eyes. It wasn't just one thing anymore. It was everything piling up over the years. The constant judgment, the subtle isolation, the quiet digs aimed at tearing down her self-worth. And every time she wondered, was this really what family was supposed to be? Mia reached the top of the stairs and paused, her hand resting on the banister. She could hear Grace's footsteps moving around downstairs, now humming softly, as if the tension had already evaporated. She wasn't one to dwell on emotions, especially not in front of Grace. No matter what was happening inside her, she had learned early on that showing weakness only gave Grace more power. With a deep breath, she turned towards her room. The small space, neatly arranged but impersonal, felt like the only place where she could be alone and pretend for a few hours that she wasn't part of this constant undercurrent of tension. Mia sat on her bed staring out the window, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The world outside seemed so calm, so far removed from the chaos inside. She let her mind wander, remembering what it had been like before her father married Grace, back when she had a different idea of what family meant. She hadn't always been so distanced from everything, so caught up in the ache of feeling unloved. Her father had always been her anchor, the one who made her feel like she mattered. He'd been a kind and steady presence in her life, someone who always seemed to know exactly what to say to make her feel safe. But since Grace entered the picture, things had changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but then more and more, her father seemed less like the man she once knew. He started spending more time at work, taking long business trips that turned into weeks, then months. And even when he was home, he seemed different. More tired, distracted, less interested in what was happening around him. Grace didn't miss those opportunities. Every time her father wasn't around, she found new ways to chip away at Mia's confidence. "You'll never be enough," Grace had once said during an argument. "Not for him, not for this family." Mia's fists clenched at the memory. Her heart was pounding now, her mind racing. She couldn't go on like this. She couldn't keep living in a house where she was constantly walking on eggshells, trying not to set Grace off, trying to find some semblance of peace. But what could she do? She couldn't just walk away. This was still her home, wasn't it? Where else would she go? There were no other options, no one to turn to. She felt trapped in a life that wasn't hers to control. Mia stood up abruptly, pacing around the room. Her eyes settled on the photo of her family on the shelf. A photo from a few years back, before Grace had entered their lives. It was a happy image. Her father smiling, his arm slung casually around Mia's shoulders, while Grace stood a little off to the side, with a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eye. She picked up the frame and studied it, wishing she could go back. Back to the time before everything felt so complicated, so suffocating. But that was just a dream, she knew. Reality had shifted, and now the person in that photo seemed like a stranger. As the evening fell, the house settled into a quiet stillness. Grace had long since retreated to her room, and the silence in the house was deafening, except for the occasional muffled sounds of the television drifting up from downstairs. Mia sat back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. The knot in her chest hadn't eased, and she knew it wouldn't any time soon. But deep down she felt it. Something was simmering beneath the surface, something that couldn't stay hidden forever. The tension in her life had reached its peak, and soon it would demand to be dealt with. The next morning, Mia woke up feeling exhausted. She hadn't slept much, too tangled in thoughts that swirled in her mind. She threw back the covers, climbed out of bed, and went to the small mirror on the wall. Her reflection greeted her. A tired face, dark circles under her eyes, and that familiar, defeated look she hadn't been able to shake for months. She sighed, running a hand through her tangled hair. The sound of movement downstairs caught her attention. Grace, already up, making breakfast. The smell of coffee and the clinking of dishes drifted upstairs. Mia's stomach turned. She didn't feel hungry, not today. She went to the kitchen reluctantly, expecting more of the same. Sure enough, Grace was standing by the stove, flipping pancakes with a practiced ease, humming softly under her breath. Her hair was perfectly styled, makeup flawless, and even in the early morning light, she looked polished and put together. "Mia," Grace said without turning around, "I thought you'd like some breakfast before you head out. You know, it's important to keep your energy up." Mia stopped in her tracks, crossing her arms. "I'm fine," she said, her voice flat. "I'm not really hungry." Grace turned slightly, giving her a cursory glance before returning to the pancakes. "Oh, come now, don't be like that. You'll feel better if you eat something." Mia rolled her eyes slightly. It wasn't genuine concern, it never was. It was just another way to make her feel small, a soft, subtle way of keeping her under control. Grace's voice never wavered, never rose, but it always carried weight, an undercurrent of authority that made everything feel like an obligation. "Grace, I'm not a child," Mia said, trying to keep her voice steady. I can take care of myself." Grace finally turned fully around, raising an eyebrow, her lips curling slightly into a faint, condescending smile. "Oh, you think you can," she said, her tone calm but sharp. "But you forget, dear, that in this house I'm the one who makes sure things run smoothly. You wouldn't survive here without me. I've kept things running long enough." Mia's fists clenched at her sides, and she took a step forward. "I don't need you to run my life, Grace. I'm capable of making my own decisions." Grace scoffed softly, shaking her head. "Capable? Oh, you might think you are, but when was the last time you did anything right, Mia? When was the last time you made a choice that actually benefited the family?" The comment hit harder than it should have. Mia clenched her teeth and turned away, staring out the window. Her chest tightened. It wasn't like she had been blind to Grace's opinion. She had spent years hearing similar words, but they always cut just a little deeper with each passing day. "You know what? Forget it," Grace continued, her voice shifting to something colder. "You'll never amount to anything on your own. You're too wrapped up in your own little world to see things for what they really are." Mia felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she forced herself to stay calm. "That's my life you're talking about," she said, turning back, "and I'm not going to sit here and let you tell me what I can and can't do." Grace gave her a long, calculating look, eyes cold, unyielding. "Oh, you think you are strong now, don't you?" She leaned slightly against the counter, her voice dropping just enough to make it clear she was toying with Mia. "But strength isn't about what you say, dear. It's about knowing your place and understanding what matters. And you'll never get it." Mia's fists clenched tighter. The words cut deeper than any insult had before. Grace's ability to twist reality, to undermine her without even raising her voice, it was something she had always been adept at. And somehow this morning it felt different. Mia's patience was running out. "You don't get to decide what matters to me," Mia said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "And I'm not going to let you control my life. I'm done letting you dictate how I should feel about things." Rafe let out a small, dismissive laugh. "Oh, please. You're dramatic, just like your father. You always think you have a say, but you don't. You're still under this roof, and you'll do as I say until you've earned your way out of here." Mia's heart pounded harder now. She knew this moment wasn't just about breakfast. It was about something far bigger. Grace had been pushing her for years, subtly but consistently, and today Mia felt it. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. She clenched her jaw, her eyes locked on Grace's, and took a step closer. "Maybe it's you who needs to get used to the idea that I'm not the same scared little girl you can boss around anymore," Mia said, her voice firm. "I'm not going to just sit here and take your crap. You don't get to treat me like this anymore." For a moment, the kitchen felt deathly still. Grace's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing, her lips tightening slightly. But she didn't flinch. She merely straightened up, her smile returning, albeit forced now. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that," Grace said, finally breaking the silence. "But this isn't about your little tantrum. This is about what's best for the family. And if you're too blind to see it, too immature to accept it, then that's your problem, not mine." Mia felt her frustration bubbling, but she kept her voice even. "You keep saying that, but what family are you talking about? It's not a family when you're constantly tearing people down to feel better about yourself. It's just you, always trying to control everything." Grace's eyes narrowed further, and this time her smile was completely gone. "You think you can lecture me on what makes a family? Please. You've never had to do the hard work, never had to carry anything for anyone else. You've had everything handed to you. What do you know about real responsibility?" Mia's heart sank. The words hit hard, but she wasn't ready to back down yet. Not after everything Grace had done over the years. "I don't need a lecture from you," Mia said, her voice steady but filled with quiet anger. "I'm not your responsibility, Grace. I'm not just some thing you get to control." Grace's eyes flashed with something Anger, perhaps, but also something darker, something calculating. For a long beat, she stared at Mia, as if considering how much further she could push. And just when it seemed like the air was about to break into another shouting match, something inside Grace seemed to shift. "Well," Grace finally said, her voice returning to its usual icy calm, "if you're so sure you've got it all figured out, then perhaps you should start proving it. Go ahead. Show me what you're made of. But be warned, actions speak louder than words. It's time you stopped running your mouth and started showing some real results." Mia stared at her, stunned for a moment. Grace's sudden shift from confrontation to indifference felt like a slap in itself, cutting off their argument and leaving the air heavy with unspoken tension. "You think you can cut me down and then just walk away like nothing happened?" Mia said quietly, but with a trace of defiance still lingering. Grace's lips curved into a slight smirk. "Oh, I'm not walking away. I'll be here, every step of the way, watching, waiting. And when you fail, you'll know exactly who was right all along." Mia clenched her fists, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. She was tired of the games, tired of being told what to do. But Grace had a way of retreating just enough to make it seem like she'd won. The subtle jabs, the cold silence afterward, it was all a strategy, and it never changed. Still, something inside Mia snapped that morning. Something told her that this wasn't about winning a verbal battle. It was about reclaiming control. She turned and walked away, biting her tongue. Grace's words had cut deep, but something had shifted. This wasn't just another argument. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored anymore. And whether Grace liked it or not, Mia was done letting her dominate. She was done being the person Grace could manipulate. It was time to stop surviving and start living on her own terms. The night had fallen quickly, casting a soft, melancholy glow through the living room. Mia sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. Outside, the world seemed quiet, but inside her chest, the unease hadn't left. She couldn't shake the lingering weight from her earlier conversation with Grace. It had felt like more than a simple disagreement. Her mind kept drifting back to the moments they had shared growing up. Memories of laughter, but also moments of silence where things felt heavy and unspoken. There were years where things had seemed simpler, but even then, there had always been an undercurrent beneath the surface. It wasn't hard to remember Grace's smile, soft yet calculated, and how her voice could turn from gentle to sharp in an instant. Mia sighed and let her head fall back against the window frame. The house felt cold tonight, more so than usual. She could hear the faint hum of silence that stretched out through the empty hallways. Silent but thick with lingering tension. Grace's words from earlier still echoed in her mind. "You'll have to grow up and take responsibility. It'll fall to you eventually." It was hard to ignore what that meant. Grace wasn't just hinting at something, she was laying the groundwork for something far more serious, and it left Mia feeling trapped. She had always known that someday she'd have to step into some kind of role, one that would either secure her place or force her into something she wasn't ready for. The memory of a family gathering flashed briefly in her mind. Her father sitting at the head of the table, Grace next to him, always composed and calm. And then there was Mia. Young, unsure, always on the fringes, never fully included. But that had been years ago, and now, sitting alone in the dark, she knew things couldn't stay the same. Grace had been waiting for her to slip up, waiting to pounce on every opportunity to remind Mia that she wasn't capable of handling anything on her own. The sound of footsteps echoed softly behind her, and Mia instinctively tensed. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Grace. Her footsteps were deliberate, careful, calculated, as if she wanted to give the impression of quiet authority. Grace walked into the room, still composed as ever. She stood in the doorway, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes watching Mia closely, scrutinizing every expression, every movement. "I see you're still up," Grace said softly, her voice steady and measured. Mia didn't look away from the window. "Couldn't sleep," she replied quietly. Grace stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Of course. Too much on your mind, I'd imagine. It must be exhausting trying to figure out how to navigate all this." Mia finally turned slightly, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" Grace's smile never wavered, but there was something almost predatory in the way she looked at her. "Oh, nothing to worry about. Just observing. You've always had a knack for making things more complicated than they need to be." Mia's fists clenched. "Is that what you think? That I'm overthinking everything?" Grace tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Well, you do have a tendency to get caught up in your own head, but maybe it's because you're afraid to face things as they really are." Mia's jaw tightened. "What exactly are you trying to say, Grace?" Grace sighed, a slow, deliberate sound that seemed to hang in the air for a moment. She took a step closer, invading Mia's space just enough to be unsettling. "I'm saying you're not ready for what's coming. You think you've got it all figured out, but you're still stuck in your little world, hoping things will fall into place on their own." "And what is coming?" Mia asked, folding her arms, trying to keep her cool. Grace smiled, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough. But until then, you need to understand something important. You can't keep pretending everything is fine. You can't keep avoiding what's happening right under your nose." Mia's heart started to race. "What do you know? What are you talking about?" Grace leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. "You think you're independent now, don't you? That you're doing fine on your own. But you don't realize how much you rely on this family. Your father might be away, but I'm still here, watching over everything." Mia's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't explain anything. What exactly do you want?" Grace's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm here to remind you that you have responsibilities. Not just the kind you think you're ready for. No, you're going to have to grow into something bigger. Bigger than what you ever thought you could handle." Mia's stomach twisted. The way Grace spoke, it was as though she knew something Mia didn't, something looming, something on the horizon. Her mind scrambled to catch up. "What exactly do you want from me?" she repeated, her voice sharper this time. Grace stepped even closer now until there was barely any space between them. She lowered her voice to a near whisper. "I want you to realize your place, to stop fighting me, to stop pretending you can do this alone. You're part of this family, Mia. You've always been part of something bigger, and whether you like it or not, it's time you start accepting your role." Mia's breath hitched. The words echoed in her mind. Accept your role. It sounded too much like Grace was trying to push her into something she wasn't ready for, into something that had always felt like it was destined to happen. "I don't need your permission," Mia said quietly but firmly, backing away slightly. "I don't need you telling me what I should do." Grace tilted her head slightly, her expression softening into something more calculating. "Oh, but it's not about permission, dear. It's about what's inevitable. You can resist all you want, but life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It moves forward, and sooner or later you'll have to choose, stand up or be left behind." Mia felt her hands shaking slightly. It wasn't just the words. It was the certainty in Grace's voice, the way she spoke, as if she had everything figured out. Like she knew something Mia didn't, something that would change everything. "And if I don't?" Mia asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper now. Grace's lips curled slightly, and for a moment she simply stared at Mia with those cold, calculating eyes. "Then you'll be left to clean up the mess, just like you always have." Mia's chest tightened. There was something so suffocating about Grace's presence, something that made her feel small, insignificant, like she was already drowning under the weight of expectations she couldn't even see yet. She turned away from Grace, stepping toward the window once more, breathing heavily. "I'm not going to let you control me, Grace." Grace's voice followed her, soft but unwavering. "You'll learn soon enough, Mia. You'll learn that there's no escaping what you're meant to be." The air between them grew heavy again. Grace's presence lingered, but she didn't stay long. After a moment, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Mia alone once more, alone with the looming questions and the feeling of something far darker waiting in the shadows. Mia sat back down at the table, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, that Grace had crossed a line she couldn't ignore anymore. The house felt heavier, darker, as if something had awakened. A truth that neither Grace nor anyone else would be able to hide. And deep down, Mia knew things were going to get worse before they got better, much worse. This chapter delves into the tension that grows between Mia and Grace, revealing Grace's manipulative nature and the ominous foreshadowing of events to come. The days had begun to blur together, each one heavier than the last. Mia moved through the house like a shadow, avoiding Grace when she could and fending off the ever-watchful gaze her stepsister cast over her every move. Every conversation, every glance from Grace seemed to carry a hidden meaning, something more sinister lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't just Grace anymore. Mia could feel it, everywhere. The house seemed to hum with tension, and every corner seemed to hold a memory she couldn't escape. Grace's warnings had been clearer than ever, and Mia couldn't shake the sense that something was coming. Something she couldn't see, but felt, looming like a storm on the horizon. One afternoon, Mia found herself alone in the kitchen brewing a pot of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the water. The air was heavy with the smell of chamomile, but it did little to soothe her frayed nerves. Her mind kept replaying Grace's words from the night before. "You'll learn that there's no escaping what you're meant to be." She set the teacup down with a soft clink, staring out the window at the falling rain. The sky was gray, the drizzle turning into a slow, steady downpour. Something in the weather seemed to match her mood, a reflection of the storm brewing inside her. She knew she couldn't keep running from this, couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. Grace wasn't going to back off. She never did, and the more Mia tried to stay independent, the more she realized she was being dragged deeper into something she didn't understand. The sound of the front door opening jolted Mia from her thoughts. She turned slightly, expecting to see Grace, but instead, David, her father, stepped inside, carrying a briefcase in one hand. His suit was still pressed, though a faint weariness crept into his shoulders. He looked up and saw Mia, his expression softening. "Mia," he greeted warmly. "Home from school already?" Mia forced a smile. "Yeah, just studying. What about you?" David nodded, moving further into the room, setting down his briefcase. "Busy day. Some meetings ran long." He glanced around, his eyes scanning the quiet kitchen. "Where's Grace?" Mia's smile faltered slightly, but she didn't let it show. "She went out with friends. Said she needed some time." David frowned slightly. "I didn't know she had plans. She didn't mention it to me." Mia shrugged, keeping her voice neutral. "She said it was last minute. Don't worry, though. She knows what she's doing." David gave her a searching look, but didn't press further. Instead, he walked over to the table and sat down across from her. His gaze softened again, his usual calm demeanor masking his concern. "How are things here?" he asked quietly. Mia hesitated, biting her lip. She knew she couldn't exactly unload everything onto him, not without revealing too much, but she couldn't ignore the worry that had been creeping up inside her. Something had shifted, and she couldn't figure out what it was. "I've been okay," she finally said, though her voice sounded less sure than she intended. "A little tired, that's all. School is keeping me busy." "School?" David nodded, his brow furrowing slightly. Tired, huh? You're sure everything's all right? You look like you've been carrying a lot on your shoulders. Mia shrugged, playing it off. It's nothing, Dad. I've just been thinking about future stuff, trying to figure out what I want to do. David gave her a soft smile. You've got time to figure that out, you know. Don't rush into anything. I always believed you could take your time and find something you truly love. Mia nodded. She appreciated his words, but part of her felt like she was holding something back, like she couldn't quite explain what was really eating at her. She glanced down at her teacup, watching the steam rise as though it might offer some kind of answer. David sighed and leaned back in his chair. You know, I've been thinking a lot about the future lately, about this house, about Grace, and about you. Mia's eyes flicked up to meet his, surprised. You been thinking about me? David smiled softly. Of course. You're my daughter, Mia, and I care about your future too. This house has always been a place where we've all shared responsibilities, helped each other out. But I worry that lately things have felt off. Mia stiffened slightly, feeling a pang of unease. What do you mean, off? David sighed. I mean, the way things have been between you and Grace. She's always been protective, let's say. But recently it feels like there's something between you two, something more than usual. Mia frowned. I don't think it's anything, we're just different, that's all. You know how she can be. David nodded thoughtfully, but his expression was guarded. Yes, I know, and I've seen how Grace can be overbearing, how she tends to take control. I suppose that's part of why I've been thinking, maybe it's time we talk. Mia's heart skipped a beat. Talk about what? David leaned forward slightly, his voice growing softer. About the future of this house, Mia. About what's going to happen here. I've been reflecting on everything, how things have been running, how responsibilities have Mia's stomach twisted. Responsibilities? What do you mean? David gave her a gentle smile. I've been thinking a lot about how Grace has been handling things in my absence. She's done well in some areas, sure, but I've started to wonder, maybe it's time for things to change. Mia's breath hitched. Change? Davy nodded slowly. I've always trusted Grace, but lately I'm not sure she's the right person to lead the family going forward. She's got a strong will, yes, but sometimes strength isn't enough. It takes more than that. It takes balance, honesty, and trust. Mia stared at her father, trying to process his words. Was this what she thought it was? Was he suggesting, Dad, what are you saying? She asked cautiously. David sighed again, leaning back in his chair. What I'm saying is that it might be time for someone else to step into a more central role in the family. Someone who can keep everything together when I'm not around. Someone I can trust to see the big picture. Mia's heart thudded louder. Are you talking about me? David's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something genuine in his gaze, something that wasn't just concern, but something close to hope. Yes, Mia, I'm talking about you. You've always been capable, thoughtful, and I've seen the strength in you. Grace may have the experience, but she doesn't always see things the way I do, especially when it comes to the future. Mia's mind raced. This was more than she had ever expected. It wasn't just about responsibilities. It was about the possibility of stepping into something much bigger. Her father was talking about something real, something that could change everything. The idea of taking on a role like this felt... But Dad, I'm not sure I'm ready for this, she murmured. It's a big responsibility. David's expression softened. That's why I've been watching you. I know you've got doubts, but you've always been someone who takes things seriously, and I believe you can rise to this. If you're willing. Mia's head spun. Could this really be happening? Was her father asking her to take on a role, their role? It felt like something straight out of Grace's warnings, but it wasn't just a threat now, it was real, and it wasn't something she could just walk away from. David reached across the table and placed his hand over hers gently. You've been part of this family long enough to know what's at stake here. You've seen the work it takes, the decisions that have to be made. But you're capable, Mia. You've got more than what it takes. You've got heart. And you've got vision. Mia's voice faltered. But what about Grace? What if she doesn't agree with this? What if she fights back? David's expression darkened slightly. Grace will resist. You can be sure of that. She doesn't like to give up control. But that's why I need someone stronger, someone who won't just follow orders, someone who can think for herself, someone who can lead. Mia's mind swirled. The possibilities felt both exhilarating and terrifying. This wasn't just about being a part of the family. It was about leading it, steering its future, shaping what came next. And if she accepted this, it could change everything between her and Grace. But it wouldn't be easy. Grace wasn't going to just step aside, and Mia knew it. The tension between them had been simmering for far too long. It had now reached a breaking point. David sat back, giving Mia space to think. Take your time to consider it. But know this. This isn't just about you or Grace. It's about the future of our family, and I need someone I can trust to carry it forward. Mia stared down at her hands, lost in thought. She could feel the weight of her father's words, the responsibility, the power, and the danger it would bring. It wasn't just a matter of choice anymore. It was a challenge to step up, to claim what was hers, and to face whatever came next. The storm outside raged on, but inside the house, another kind of storm was brewing, one that would change everything.